Well, here we are. I'm in space. Jen's in Calgary. And Jen, I was surprised to learn this week that Alberta kids go back to school before Labor Day. So for the first time in months, you have a quiet house.
Yeah, no one is quite clear about why that happened this year. And I haven't bothered to ask because I just figured the sooner I can get them out of my bloody house, the happier I was going to be. But yeah, they went back yesterday. So they're going to be back for like a day and a half. They have half days on Fridays. And then we're going to have a Labor Day weekend, and then they'll be back again on Tuesday. So I'm not quite sure what the purpose of this is, but
Yeah.
I'll take the time. That's
Mine
for
don't go
sure.
back until Tuesday. And my wife is a teacher too. So I'm going to go from full house to, and that's something I should have turned off before, but I'm going to go from full house to empty house in like a day. It's my productivity in September always spikes.
Yeah, for this exact reason, because summer's hell for parents. I think the most important thing to note is that yesterday, on the first day back to school, I managed to get a yoga class in. I got all the presents bought for my youngest's birthday, and I got a haircut. Plus, I had a reasonably productive work day, and that's the magic of schooling for you.
I love it.
Mhm.
It's yeah, no, it's pretty fun. But also
I mean, my
sad
hair.
because
You're
I
right. My hair is pretty fun. No,
your hair is glorious. I do miss the kids when they're gone, but also my productivity really bounces.
yeah, it's nice. Anyway, back to school or back to work, back to our work. Um, I think there were only really three things to talk about, to be
Yeah,
honest with you.
it was a quiet week on my front. There wasn't a ton going on this time through.
So last week, during this podcast, we noted that the Liberals were in deep shite, and as a result, they were almost certainly going to pivot to a wedge issue come the fall. It does seem as if the Conservatives have, what's the word I'm looking for? Exceeded them, expected them, gone ahead of them in the vanguard of them.
Exceeded. Yeah.
Exceeded is the correct way of saying this.
Keep talking to you just for 1 second. My son's iPad's in the room with me. It's ringing off the hook here. Give me 1 second. I'm just gonna mute it, but you keep talking.
Sure.
You
Okay.
entertain the
So
listeners for 10 seconds.
I can manage that, even with my words alone. And I don't even have to resort to more problematic tropes. But anyway, yeah, so the Conservatives have exceeded them. I believe New Brunswick and Saskatchewan have both not just launched, but really actually it's publicized legislation that they have put forward to say schools must be forced to disclose if their children are going to be changing genders or socially transitioning at school. Personally, let's just start off with the fact that that is really strategically done. That every single moment that a conservative spends defending or arguing about parental rights, trans issues, puberty blockers, the whole thing, every single moment they are spending talking about that is a moment they are not talking about the economy, which I happen to know is the thing that they actually want to talk about because that is a winning issue for them. Trans
Yep.
issues are very much a shield issue for conservatives. They are on a roll. They're seeing good positive momentum. Economic issues are sword issues for them. And in case you're not aware of that particular analogy, this goes back some time. I can't remember who coined it. It could have been Harper actually coined it. But essentially, conservatives see the world divided between shield issues and sword issues. There are issues in which they are on the defensive. There are issues in which
Yeah.
they are on the offensive. Trans issues are very much shield issues. So even if they feel like we're going to put forward a policy that might be extremely popular, this is still not going to be the thing they want to be focused on or talking about.
Yeah, the shield issues are how you protect your existing vote base.
Yeah.
Yeah, the sword issues are how you go out and you win over new voters.
Yeah.
People who would admit I've never voted for you or didn't last time at least.
Yeah. So anyway, this comes out. You've got Scott Moe trumpeting how popular this or how great this legislation is. I will get into the legislation in a minute, but and then you have Pierre asked about it as we would expect, and Pierre said, well, essentially he pulled out a parental rights note, and that is, I think parents have a right to know this sort of stuff. Of course, this caused all the progressives to lose their minds. They started accusing Pierre of dog whistling and parental rights is a right-wing dog whistle. And then we go back to our old conversations about far right wing, and dog whistles and how essentially these things have lost all of their meaning. How should I say this? You can't openly dog whistle. If you can hear it, you're the dog. That's the purpose of what a dog whistle literally means.
Yeah.
Pierre wasn't dog whistling. He was expressing his views on this topic. You can disagree with his views on the topic, but it's not a dog whistle. And of course, this caused, Justin Trudeau is now weighed in. Marcy Ian is now weighed in. This is a life or death issue for trans kids, blah, 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 blah. And now the whole thing has been politicized. And then what started circulating around the Twitterverse was an Angus Reid poll that found that actually not only does mandatory disclosure of these sorts of things have high support, it has supermajority support pretty much across the board. The only areas where the support even dips for these policies is in people who are very young, so 18 to 24, like recent college graduate types. And even there, I mean, support for parents knowing that their kids are going through social transitions at school is still upwards of 70%.
Yeah, I think the overall number was what, 85?
It's like, yeah, you can generally say that this is about an 85 to 15 split here on this topic, which means
that's the kind of number you get if you poll on like, is ice cream tasty?
So like trying to portray support for parental rights here as some kind of
far right
position that is really rooted in evil and bigotry would be the equivalent of trying to claim that support for abortion rights is because people really, really just like seeing fetuses aborted, just don't like children. I mean, like, it ain't it. And when you're talking about supermajority support, you can't credibly make that claim anymore. Because I just don't think that 85% of the population is, secretly harboring and festering over their hatred of transgender kids. It's not the concern. That's not the issue. So anyway, I think that this is a bit of a dead letter issue, bluntly. Like, I do think that it's very possible the Conservatives, at least at the provincial level, might be unknowingly playing 4D chess because they have already come out and framed this issue in such a way that they've framed it in a way that has supermajority support with Canadians. And if the Liberals were to try to wedge them on the trans issue now, I think it would be actually harder for them to do that than they might have otherwise tried. Like, essentially, I don't like this legislation. I don't like making trans issues a wedge issue. I have huge issues with all of this. And I have really huge issues with legislating this at all because, bluntly, it's a Pandora's box. But by coming out and being proactive on this, they may have preemptively framed the issue in a way that is going to favor them. And that might dissuade the Liberals from trying to use trans issues as a wedge in the future. I don't know. Maybe that's me giving Mo et al. Too much credit. But that's kind of my read on it.
One of the things that kind of pops up is that this could be a possibility. And I honestly believe it, like, despite all the heated rhetoric on this issue, I actually think it would be possible to craft a mainstream position that would have broad support, even among the various partisan stripes, which would be that trans people deserve legal protections, access to health care, and to be treated with dignity. And that there need to be some either regulations or standards around hormone blockers, puberty blockers, and the transitioning of youth. And probably that we stop being credulous idiots about putting men in women's prison the moment they identify as trans and things like that. I actually think, like, outside of the extremes of the culture war battles, you would actually not have a hard time coming up with a fairly coherent position that would have broad-based support. But we have talked a lot recently in recent weeks about how Pierre Poilievre and the conservative movement broadly is captured by the fringe of its base. This could be an issue where the Liberals actually find themselves captured by the fringe of their base. And even like, this could be a rare opportunity. And I'm with you. Like, I'm not cynical. Sorry, I am cynical. I'm not naive about why the conservative premiers are talking about this. But if they do stumble, even accidentally and ass backward, into a popular position here,
a popular and sensible position, like a genuinely reasonable position,
it might be Marcy Ian and Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland who find themselves base captured. And this is something we have in recent years largely thought about in the context of the Conservatives, and on some economic and social issues, the NDP as well. But Justin Trudeau might have a difficult time, especially given his current polling situation, going out and taking a moderate, broadly supportable position, because he'll get murdered on Twitter.
Yep.
And
that's right.
I think, like, we talked about this more last week, and I'm not trying to change the topic here, but I think when you look at Trudeau's recent polls, what you see is that he is currently doing well precisely nowhere. He has no good news. And I suppose if he's feeling YOLO-y, he could go out and basically take that as an opportunity to make some decisions. But knowing politicians the way I do, and not even liberal politicians, any politicians, when their polls get bad, they get more cautious. So if the Conservatives have, again, perhaps, no, 100% cynically and perhaps accidentally stumbled onto a sensible popular position here, I don't know if the Liberals will be able to actually move to it here. And
Can
it
I
was Evan Scrimshaw wrote a really interesting column about this week, where he basically says, I'm paraphrasing here. I don't mean to mangle his words, but he basically said, I'm probably in the 15% minority here, but that doesn't mean I don't draw correct lessons from it, which is basically, when you're in the 15% minority, you don't necessarily have to surrender, but you have to move very carefully. And he said there was probably an opportunity to go out and come up with some maybe imperfect, but livable, moderate, supportable, popular position here. But if there are fanatics, culture warrior types screaming at Trudeau for abandoning children to death, I don't know how he responds to that. Like Marcy Ian actually had a couple of days ago what I thought was maybe the defining tweet of the Liberals' time in office, where she basically said the legislation being contemplated by Conservatives is a life and death threat to trans youth. And that's why she was going to vigorously monitor it. Like, okay. Like, and that really is one of those examples where these guys just can't help themselves. Like,
and they can't see it. They can't even see it. That's the problem.
Well, it's like one of my recent themes of late is that the Liberals used to be good at communicating, and they're not anymore. And Marcy Ian would have been better off in that situation saying nothing, because to go out and say, like, they're going for the, hey, we're going to take a strong stand, this is a life or death issue, but she doesn't know how to end the tweet. Like, there is
there's no action attached to it. Yeah, there's no call to action attached to it. So
she honestly would have been better off saying nothing.
She would have been better off even
she says something and she looks like an idiot.
No, if anything, she would have been better off by being like, if you support us, sign up here, so that she could at least could have maximized this by starting to build an external email list, either for her own purposes or to grab an email list to find particular issues and supporters on this issue who she could then organize and mobilize. But the other thing I think that's interesting about all of this, and this is again a very bird's eye view, is that to me this is highly indicative of a real pendulum swing in Canada on trans issues. Because 2 or 3 years ago, I don't think this is how this conversation goes. I really don't. I think that, to me, the fact that 85% of people are willing to come out and be like, yeah, no, is a real fuck off into the sea with this shit moment. And I think that it is coming off of years of, I should say this, conversations around trans issues that are detached from the lived experiences of most people. And it comes after years of having not just transphobic evil shit, but also legitimate and reasonable critiques and concerns about things like women in prisons, trans women in sports, puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for minors. There are legitimate and reasonable concerns about these things. And if you dared express them, you would be shut down as a hateful transphobic bigot who just wanted trans children to commit suicide. That is so extreme, and it's so unreasonable, and it's so detached from reality that there was always inevitably going to be a backlash to that kind of rhetoric. And now we're seeing it. We're starting to see it foment. And not all of that backlash is good. Not all that backlash is reasonable, and not all that backlash is going to be sensible. And but
every bit of it was inevitable.
But every bit of it was inevitable. And I'm genuinely quite nervous about that backlash because, like I said, I think that legislation on this issue is a real problem. I don't want politicians, right or left, dictating the kind of conversations that have to be happening or not happening between parents and teachers according to sort of their own base affiliations or their own very narrow political agendas and desires. I would like to have a situation where parents can be confident that their teachers are being open and honest with them about what's going on with their kids at school. And I want to have a situation as well where teachers, if they have genuine concerns about what's going on at home, have avenues for addressing that in a sensible way. And I don't think hardcore blanket legislation serves either of those ends. I think it just breaks down trust between parents and teachers in ways that are not helpful or useful in any way. So I would like to start from a place of assuming that the teachers are, for the most part, not perfect, but have the right intentions in their heads screwed on straight, and that parents also, not exclusively, there are exceptions, but for the most part, have good intentions and have their heads screwed on straight. And let's start from that good faith assumption. And let's, if we find that into this process that, either of those assumptions prove to be false, then we can see if there's a place for legislation. But right now, I just don't see that this is the appropriate way to go. And like I said, the real problem I have with this legislation is that when you start saying, well, mandatory disclosure is defined by law, you're also opening the door for the opposite, which is mandatory non-disclosure as dictated by law. If you wouldn't want the other one, you don't want this one either. So I don't want the state in this. And I especially don't want the state in this when we're in the middle of a high moral panic, bluntly.
I avoid culture war stuff. And it's a deliberate choice I made years ago to not write about culture war stuff. And there were honestly two reasons for that. First of all, I think it's well served. Like, I think the market is more than sufficiently served by people who are just fully into it.
The line's not going to generate an audience repeating what everybody else is already saying.
But this goes back to when I was at the National Post. This has just followed me throughout my career. I think culture wars, the market for that is endlessly well served. But I also think fundamentally, and this is something I've observed directly, culture war issues are a trap. And I have seen smart, reasonable people go insane. And sometimes they come out of it a few years later and they're like, whoa, like, wow, that was crazy. Culture war issues, I think, are unhealthy. And I think they're unhealthy to our body politic overall. And I think they're unhealthy to the participants. And there's something just in my personality when everyone's moving in the other direction. Like, I'm not contrarian per se, but let me just tell you something. The more people tell me to watch The Mandalorian, the less likely it becomes I'm ever going to watch The Mandalorian. Like, if everybody else is watching it, I lose interest. And if everybody's fighting about whatever the issue is, I just lose interest in it. I want to go do something else. But I want to mention on the record here, and this is not the first time I've said this publicly, and you know this. And what was it? Was it about 7 or 8 years ago that I made a prediction that I think is coming true now? It was a long time ago, and I had said to you and a few other colleagues at the National Post that it was going to be the trans issue that was going to crack the progressive coalition. And I said it at the time because I said gay rights, I think, makes intuitive sense to people. Trans issues don't. And I don't say that as a moral judgment, but I think you can basically convince Jimmy at the mechanic shop that his cousin Tony, he's the same as you. He just likes guys instead of girls. And Jimmy at the mechanic shop might go, well, that's weird, but I love my cousin Tony. You tell Jimmy at the mechanic shop that cousin Tony wants to cut his dick off and grow a pair of tits. And I think that's harder for Jimmy at the mechanic shop to get. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but I'm saying that's harder sell.
I disagree with you. Do you want to know what I think actually takes the trans stuff into a very different space than the gay rights stuff? That we're dealing with minors.
Well, here's the thing. We're on different pages here. I think the problem is the progressive movement, instead of kind of going, this is a harder sell. Like, they're going to take more education, more time, more effort. They basically decide to go the opposite strategy, which is a maximalist position, and anyone who's outside of it, we yell at for wanting kids to be killed. And instead of there being a kind of a gradual process of gay rights, which unfolded over generations, it was like trans issues, which no one was talking about 5 years ago, are
You
now like a
we
shibboleth of whether or not you are a decent human being.
Yeah,
And
like
there,
we went from not talking about trans issues at all to, if you don't have things in your pronouns, and if you don't acknowledge that sex isn't real,
that you're a
you're a
bigot.
monster. You're a monster. I mean, that is a lot of a shift. But as I said, I don't think that it's actually that hard for most people to understand, at least intellectually. Somebody,
Intellectually, maybe, but
oh no, an individual saying, "Look, I feel like I'm a person of a different sex, and I want to go through transition surgery." I think that a liberal framework has no issues with that. There's no conflict with that. In fact, if you even want taxpayer funded surgery, to go, sure, cool, I don't care. I
yep.
mean, when it comes to adults, what sets the trans issues apart is that the culture war has shifted into the realm of children. And that's so, if you are a parent and you have that complicated relationship with your child, you know that is a very atavistic, very lizard brain, deep love, deep responsibility, very complicated relationship and dynamic. And you, Bobby, want to do what you want to do at 18 plus, that's your call. But when you're talking about kids, you are stepping on some real deep buttons there. And I think that a lot of the people who are on the trans activist side have jumped on those buttons absolutely mercilessly and are now surprised when atavistic lizard brain is now popping up collectively like a cobra over the collective masses, going, like, you can't actually be surprised by this. I'm sorry. That it was naive on your part if you were surprised that there was going to be a backlash to this. And I'm not saying, as someone who wants to be part of that backlash, I don't.
No, you're not. I know you're
But
not. I'm not
but
either. But
no,
we both we both understand communication.
and we both have kids. So like like, you want to take your kid to anyway, I don't really want to get into this, but I mean, like, if you think that there isn't going to be a deep societal concern with, for example, giving kids puberty blockers, especially when we've seen how some of that turns out in Europe, that is not realistic. And I think that you are not going to get over or gloss over that concern by just calling everybody who disagrees with you a hateful bigot. If
Yeah,
you
but
think that there's not going to be a concern with children changing their pronouns in school, which, by the way, statistically speaking, tends to lead to quite a lot of those children then seeking out irreversible medical treatments or getting on a pipeline for reversible medical treatments. If you think that parents as a whole are going to be okay with that without being consulted or talked about it, I don't think you're being realistic about that relationship and the responsibilities that parents feel as a part of that relationship. And it may
yeah,
be a minority of kids, but it's all parents who will feel implicated in that decision.
I think you're right, but I still do think, to my original point, that the trans issue requires a bigger leap than gay rights. And this is for example, I was recently, just this summer, talking with a neighbor, kind of a friend, whose kids are friends with my kids, and I was just hearing a story about a soccer tournament one of them had been at, for a girls' soccer team, where one of the opposing teams had a male identifying as female player. And this was, I think, the 12-year-old age group. And the male identifying as female player was probably 50 pounds heavier, faster, and stronger than the girls, and injured two of them on the opposing team.
Yeah. How many female sports injuries are you going to tolerate before you're willing to acknowledge that this
Yeah,
actually isn't a balanced situation?
yeah, and people will say that's an outlying example, or that I'm engaging in rumor mongering. People can think whatever they want. My point is simply that there's a very good chance that parents on the opposing team, who might be politically and socially progressive or moderate and had a very open mind to a lot of these issues, upon seeing a biologically male 12-year-old steamroller a biologically male, I think it was 11-year-old girl, because the team was 11 and 12, is going to
Female
become
girl.
politically radicalized on that issue.
Yup.
And I think, again, we could probably come up with a really broad framework that would have broad support here. But when you have situations like, if that 12-year-old biological male that I'm referring to identifies as gay, there's no problem in that in the sports perspective. There may be homophobia issues. I don't mean to downplay that, but there's no issues of fairness of competition and stuff like that. But I'm going to bet that there are parents on that opposing soccer team who have now actually become radicalized in a way that didn't have to happen if we had more sensible policies.
I suspect you already know parents who've been radicalized. I mean, the other thing I'm going to say here,
No one has said as much to me, but everybody knows what I do, and people, you know what it's like to live in this industry. People are cautious what they say to you, which is nice because it gets me out of small talk.
I think I will say is also, I'll should I say this? Remember back in the day when we were like, we are one major Jane Creba style violence away from people getting really radicalized on crime in Toronto? You were talking about that a couple weeks ago.
Yep.
We are one 16-year-old girl in a rugby team gets smashed by a trans female, biological male trans female who has gone through some stage of puberty, which, by the way, has irreversible effects on strength and size. That even if you put them on hormones, you can't negate the initial benefits of that. They're going to get their head cracked in and they're going to wind up in hospital or dead. And that's going to wind up radicalizing incredible numbers of parents, especially of daughters, who are going to say, I'm not going to let my daughter participate in sport if the risk of her getting killed by a biologically male opponent is this. I don't think the trans movement's going to have, I don't think they're appreciating the danger they're putting themselves in by setting the expectations that they're setting, right? Like, I think that this is my concern for trans people. And that is, if you set reasonable expectations for the society requiring tolerance and acceptance with some exceptions, some logical, reasonable exceptions, like, you know, sports, prisons, whatever, maybe you take that more on a case-by-case basis, right? But if you don't have those little, if you're going to take the maximalist position here, you're going to put yourself in a situation where someone's going to get raped in a prison, a 16-year-old girl is going to get killed on a rugby field. Something of that nature is inevitably going to happen, and people aren't going to be rational in their response to that. They're not going to be measured or rational. They're going to say, fuck you all. Now the backlash coming the other way is going to be twice as swift, and it's going to be very nasty. And that's my actual concern here, is that, you know, we were going in a direction on gay rights and liberal policies and liberal inclusion. And I think all of that's being put at risk.
The way the debate is developed is, well, it's twofold. First of all, one comment I'm going to make is that if that happens, it will be global news.
Oh, absolutely.
It will not be small town girl written up in local newspaper and AM radio station. Like Daily Mail in the UK will blast that to 1 billion people.
Yep.
The other issue is that because of the way this debate has shaped up, and because of how it has been portrayed as, you know, Q minister in here in completely life and death existential terms. And I understand why. I do understand the challenges trans individuals have, at least in the abstract. But the problem is the people who wish to do right by them do not have a safe position to retreat to, even in the face of a completely egregious overstep.
Yeah.
Because any step backward is tantamount, because you said at the beginning, oh, you want children to commit suicide then. You know, and the funny thing is too, one of the things that comes up, I'm with you, Jen. I don't support legislation on this because I think the legislation is a stunt and provocative. But what's interesting is how I am married to an elementary school teacher, and I'm well aware, probably not as well as she is, but I've heard about this over the years. Teachers are subjected to a series of mandatory reporting criteria for real or suspected concerns. Mm-hmm. Eating disorders, mental health, suicidal ideation, physical or sexual abuse in the home, bullying. There are policies in place that compel reporting. It would not be a massive logical leap to go to identifying by new pronouns fits in that same basket. And people will say, oh, but then you're conflating like identifying with new pronouns as something bad, like bullying. I don't mean it that way. Everyone who's studied the stats on this knows full well that trans-identified youth have higher suicide rates. Mm-hmm. And if you are a teacher and you become aware of a risk factor for a student and you do not report it, that's not a neutral position. That actually moves us away from what we have been trying to do to keep kids safe. And
because again, let's also be blunt. If that child needs some kind of psychological services or help, that's going to come from the parents. The schools don't have the resources to provide that.
No, the teachers file the reports and move on because it's not their job.
That's right. It's parents' job.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I I'm saying this as a spouse of a teacher.
Well, and also, can we also point out
They
that
already
if,
put up with a lot.
yeah, I know they do, but also the teachers, by the way, if they suspect that there is likely abuse happening at home, they have to report that too, which means if they suspect that, even regardless of the, say a kid is changing pronouns, if they suspect that reporting that would put that child in danger, they have a mandatory obligation to report that, because then now they're looking at risk abuse. So like, and that's appropriate. Like, you know what I mean? Like I want teachers to report something if they think something's off at home. That's appropriate. That's correct.
Yeah.
My other concern with all of this is that a lot of the we don't want you to disclose this to parents, because if you disclose this to parents, you know, you're putting kids at risk of abuse. Firstly,
you're taking them out of the closet, so to speak.
Yeah, but the first problem with that is this isn't quite the same thing as sexuality. It's a different kettle of fish for reasons that I don't really want to get into at the moment, but I do think it's different. But also, it's automatically assuming that parents are potential abusers, and that the ultimate responsibility to protect the children from the abusers of their parents lies with the state. I think that's a really dangerous assumption to be operating on. Secondly, I think it expands the definition of abuse. The type of abuse that I think people are really worried about isn't just like dad's going to kick you out of the house or mom's going to beat you, which is a reportable offense and ought to be. The type of abuse that I think they're really concerned about is that the parents aren't going to be immediately affirming.
Yep. Or
that the parents are going to potentially say, okay, that's new. Let's take you to a shrink and we can work that through that problem. This is not the preferred option here. Just so we're clear, a parent not being immediately affirming is not necessarily abusive. That is not necessarily an inherently abusive position to be coming at this from. But that is kind of my issue here. And I think that when you expand the definition of abuse in that way, you're putting, and when you're operating under the assumption that parents are abusers and the state has an obligation to protect kids from their parents, you're operating from a place where we are inevitably going to lead to this position where if a parent isn't immediately affirming of their child's social transition, that you're setting up a scenario where that the state is going to step in and take parents away. And I think that is where this logic and this reasoning inevitably takes us. It takes us to a place where the state is stepping in and removing kids from parents who aren't immediately affirming.
You know, it's funny. I don't think your analysis there is wrong, but I'm going to step in. I'm going to accept 95% of what you said. I'm going to step in. I'm going to replace the conclusion. What you're actually talking about there would probably not result in the state stepping in and taking kids away. What it would probably do would result in the collapse of any semblance of the child welfare system, because the bureaucracy is already overwhelmed.
Well,
like, I'm just thinking, how many stories have we heard in recent years of kids dying of like starvation and like neglect or severe abuse? And when we really boil it down, like occasionally we find out that the kid, like, that it was a blind spot. The kid didn't exist. There was no paper trail, right? And nobody knew. But more often what we find out is that there were any number of red flags and the system was not able to follow up. And, you know, I'm sensitive to the fact, Jen, that you and I may sound like we are or will be labeled as anti-trans on this issue. And I think we're both not.
We're not.
But I think there has been a failure of those who would be most vocally in favor of trans youth or trans people in general to think through some of what the proposals, or at least the arguments being made, will lead to here.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree with you. There is a real danger, and I do not deny this danger. I agree with this danger, that some children revealing themselves as either gender diverse or having a homosexual sexual preference could put those kids in danger. They could be killed. They could be abused. They could be thrown out of the house. The danger of that is real. But I do not trust Canadian bureaucracy to distinguish that from a parent having a hard time accepting it, or a parent needing some time, or a parent going, it's a phase and we'll get you therapy, or we'll pray on it together.
Yeah.
And
one of these things merits state intervention, and one of these things don't.
Do we leave that up to the teachers?
Well,
like who's the person making that decision?
I think you kind of have to. I think you basically have to have a faith that teachers are the ones who are interacting with these kids, and they're the ones interacting with the parents. And I think you got to leave it to you've got to leave it the discretion to the teachers to leave it to them and just trust that they're professionals and hope that hope for the best. Because I don't know what the better solution is. Like I don't know what the better option is. Like I don't think the teachers are out there trying to indoctrinate all the kids into being trans. I just don't think that that is a reasonable assumption to make. I mean, that's not a reflection
I
of
see they've
my
got to you.
yeah, I know, but I mean, that's not a reflection of my experience with elementary school. I don't know if that's a reflection of your experience with elementary school, but I'm just I looking at my kids' teachers and going like, you look like you're out of central casting for a grade 1 teacher. Like, you know what I mean? Like,
You know what? My kids are a few years older than yours, so I've had more experience as a parent. And also, again, I this is like I think third time I've been to this. I'm married to a teacher. I think teachers are a lot like the broader population, which is to say about 90-95% of them are just nice people trying to do the best job they can.
mm-hmm.
But about 5 to 10% of them have the fanatic gleam in their eye.
Yep.
And it's,
but I don't. Sure, I'm sure there's fanatics out there, but I don't see some kind of concerted effort to trans the kids. Like it's I don't know.
I think
I'm not
teachers are
seeing
kind
it.
of typical of the human
Yeah,
subgroup, right?
completely.
Like
So like I'm not really worried about putting my kids in a public school and being like that they're going to be converted. Like that's nonsense. I just don't think that that's a risk. But if my kid did change pronouns at school and I think that I'm a good parent, I'm not abusive and I'm pretty open-minded and I'm pretty loving of my children within reason. I mean, they can be assholes, but anyway, and I found out that the school were conspiring to keep that a secret from me. I
because they
think
had
that
concluded they could not trust you with
because
that information.
I think that would be more offensive and more problematic for me than the fact that the kids had trans. So like I think that to break down trust between caregivers that way is really dangerous. I really do think that. So like I said, that's kind of where I land on this.
Yeah, no, and it reminds me of a column I wrote very early in the pandemic. I think it was the first summer. I think it was the first summer, so summer of 2020, where the Globe and Mail had run an article talking about a bunch of wealthy parents who were all self-identified progressives who had put their kids into private schools or learning pods or things like that to get around the lockdowns in the schools and the shutdowns. And there was just this wonderful hand-wringing comments from these self-styled progs going, I really value public education, but like the moment something threatened my kids' education and I had the means and I just ripped them out.
Yep.
And favored my offspring here. Like that's a different topic, I know, but it's also a lesson.
Totally related topic.
Yeah, like
and it goes back to the lizard brains comes to my kids. I don't fucking think so.
When your ideology or your even I'll even be less cynical, when your genuine desire to help people does not survive first contact with human nature, you need a new plan. And this sort of loops me back to what Scrimshaw was saying in that column he wrote, which I thought was quite good. He's not asking anyone to surrender. He's asking them to be smart. And I think instead, what we're going to get is a lot of the same what we've already gotten, which is if we just yell at you over and over that you're a bigot, it'll work.
Well, and the problem why that doesn't work is that when it comes to parenthood, and this is what people aren't understanding.
Call me a bigot.
Call me a bigot. It's my kid. Yeah. I don't care. I don't care. When it comes to my kid, call me whatever the fuck you want. That's the problem, because that's the reflex people are going to have to get over here. So calling people bigots is not going to work. Calling them abusers is not going to work. Like I will be whatever bad guy I need to be to protect my children. That's the parental mindset.
I think the most militant members of our progressive movement might need a strategy reset, at least on this issue. Well, for what it's worth, some of you and I have spoken about a couple of times before, privately, I think. I don't know if we've ever mentioned this on the podcast. You and I have both actually had the sense that the pendulum kind of hit its max about a year or two ago.
Yep.
There was a story, and I don't closely follow the trans stuff for all the reasons I said before. I think cultural war issues are traps, but there has been, it's actually seemed to have started in Europe, like sort of an unwinding of sort of some of the maximalist positions that had been taken regarding prisoners or athletics, and also age limits on when irrevocable treatments are undertaken. Maybe we're a few years behind that here. I hope at the end of this we actually come, like, see, when the pendulum swings, it's an opportunity to find a sustainable, reasonable status quo.
Yeah.
But it's also an opportunity just for things to go completely batshit the other way. And honestly, given the age we live in, I'm betting on batshit.
Well, it certainly has gone batshit in places in the United States. Like, as I said, I might have some concerns about puberty blockers for kids, but I would never want to be in a society that totally banned all puberty blockers for all children. I don't think that's a sensible response to this issue, because I think there are children for whom it might be beneficial. I would like to ensure that there's strong controls in place and that this is not overprescribed. I would like a lot of monitoring in place. I would want to watch the long-term outcomes of the small number of children who are going to take advantage of those interventions to make sure that the long-term outcomes are positive for them.
But Ron DeSantis is going to go raise.
But Ron DeSantis is going to raise $30 million on totally blocking this because, anyway, for an issue we have nothing to say on this issue. We certainly did say a lot on this issue.
Do you want me to get into what my column thesis was, or should I save that for a future column?
Save it for a future column. You can save it for the Dispatch. I want you to write about the trans stuff because I feel like I'm too in it. In our Dispatch. But the other thing I wanted to talk about, of course, the other major thing was the weird travel advisory for 2S LGBTQI people that Canada put out as a stunt against the Americans in response to some of their trans stuff.
I think you've said it all. Like, it's a stunt.
It's a stunt.
You and I have been warning for weeks that the Liberals are going to go for the culture war wedges. So in our Dispatch last week, in our podcast last week, you and I kind of rattled off a couple things that could be wedges the Liberals try to use against the Conservatives. And a bunch of Conservatives, all of them, it's nice to be listened to, but a bunch of them reached out at once and said, you guys left immigration off the table. And I went, yeah, okay, fair enough. So I included that in the Dispatch. One of the other things maybe we should have made explicit was what a conservative friend of mine told me this week, which is to say, he said we weren't wrong in our analysis, but he found a more simple way to put it. What he said to me was, look, Pierre Poilievre's at 40% of the polls, Justin's at 26%, and he's sinking, and his demographics suck. And my conservative friend said we're stronger than the Liberals on all the issues that matter to Canadians right now. We're in a good strategic position. So he says the Liberals will accept that because they're very smart politicians, and they won't run against Pierre Poilievre. They'll run against Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. Yeah. So that's what they're doing.
Yeah. And then, like, a day after he tells me that, the government of Canada rolls out a travel advisory. And
let's also point out, travel advisories are meant to be specific advisories for individuals traveling to a place, risks that they may face. I'm not saying it's beyond possible that, like, somebody who's a gay individual traveling to America might face an increased risk of being targeted for getting beaten up or whatever. Yeah, of course, that's a risk. And I think it's worthwhile to point that out. But he's not any more or less at risk of being beaten up because Florida has just passed some crazy law banning puberty blockers for children. You know what I mean? Like, that's nuts, and that's an abuse of the travel warning system for your own political wedge issue and your own political stunts, essentially. So anyway, I think that's a pretty straightforward position. I think most people can see that. And then, of course, the last thing on the list was the government has just released its draft regulations for C18. People who have been following us, unfortunately, should be very well informed about C18. It's the law that's making it so that Meta has decided to not post your news on Facebook. The reason why the draft regulations are important is because the legislation itself has passed royal assent. But how that law would be put into action was left for the CRTC to decide. And so they've put forward the draft regulations to sort of figure out the actual technical go-tos. And the hope was that when the draft regulations were released, that both Google and Meta would find some of the compromises that they were looking for on things like finding exemptions to the bill or setting caps on the amount of money they'll be forced to negotiate or spend as a result of the bill, and that this might bring them back to the table. Well, the draft regs are out. Facebook was always very skeptical that there was a way forward through the draft regs because they're like, the legislation says what it says.
Well, they said explicitly the legislation's too specific already.
Like there's the
they
draft
said it
regs
couldn't be fixed in regs.
Yeah, the draft couldn't fix regs. They've stuck by that now that the regs have come out. They've said, nope, this is not salvageable. We're going to keep news off their platform. Now, I think it's also very interesting to note that I think that Facebook has been pleasantly surprised by the outcome of keeping news off the platform. I think that that's led to a more pleasant environment for most of the users, and I don't think that they've seen any outflow of.
I like Facebook more now. I have not used Facebook since Cambridge Analytica. All of a sudden, my Facebook feed is full. It's
Nice
full of like
pictures.
people I went to high school with, like extreme Star Trek minutia and NHL like season previews. My Facebook experience hasn't been this good since university.
So, and actually, I don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility that Facebook's going to take its learnings from Canada and apply it more broadly and just take news off the platform, because it's just, there's no money in it for them. And there's more hassle than there is potential upside for them. I don't think that's off the table for them. But anyway, so Facebook's out, they're gone, as long as C18 is active. The question still outstanding is whether or not the draft regs have brought Google back to the table. So my understanding is that the draft regs, I mean, I haven't read them myself, I don't understand them just yet, so I'm going to put a caveat in this. But my basic understanding is that the draft regs are as much a capitulation to Google as the actual legislation will allow. I don't know if it's going to be enough. And if it's not enough, that means Google takes news off its platform and we are in deep shite. The problem is that, as I said, we'll see what Google does and how it responds. I'm going to hold off on this to wait a day, see if they respond at all. But that is worth commenting on and noting. If Google stays in, regardless of what's in the draft regs, the Liberals are going to treat that as a victory lap. They're going to say, we've won the day. We forced them to pay. What's actually going on behind the scenes is that the money that Google was probably paying legacy organizations through licensing fees and other types of programs is just going to get reallocated back into C18. And my suspicion is the way the draft regs are written will allow them a lot more control over how that money is actually distributed. So I don't think it's beyond the possibility that the legacy organizations are going to be financially worse off after C18 than they were before, and that actually some small publications might actually see this as a real genuine boon, because Google would much rather reward small upstarts than zombie legislators or zombie media companies, essentially, that have lobbied them and put them in this position in the first place. So I don't know. I don't know if that's even where this is going to go. I think everything's still very much up in the air, but I think that that's probably worth a note in the dispatch.
So that just came out this morning, I think, right?
That just came out this morning. I've not had a time to go through it.
Yeah, me neither.
And also they're, I'm going to take this personally. They did like a technical briefing for media, but they did it at like 9:30 Eastern time. And then they released the announcement warning about it like in the morning. So by the time I had my tea, I was like, oh, I've already missed this technical briefing. So I think that I'd like to believe that was a personal fuck you, but there you go.
Well, honestly, it's been a relatively quiet week on my front. The Greenbelt scandal is not going well for Doug Ford.
And it's also one of the reasons why Doug Ford's weighed in on some of the trans stuff.
Yeah, probably.
Distraction.
Yep. But, I mean, I can, there's no point really mentioning it at any length here on the podcast. I can just mention it in a blurb in the dispatch. Sure. And honestly, and that's, August is over. Like that, we just got through the dullest traditional news week of the year, and I'm glad to see the back of it. So next week things start heating up again, getting real. Yep, absolutely. So let's hold it off there. I think that's good. I think we talked too much about trans issues that we don't actually care about, but that's fine. And should we try and get this written today if we can? Yeah, but I don't know if I can. So let's try, let's try. Not promise what we can't. Okay, good. Well, at the very least, we can get our nice little podcast up today. Yep. This will be up in a couple of hours. Okay. Cheers. All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye.